Welcome to the SharkBytes Podcast. My name is Roland Knall and I'm one of the co-developers of Wireshark. In this podcast, we will discuss all things about Wireshark as well as topics from the world of Packet Analysis and SharkFest, which is our Packet Analysis and Developer Conference. You will meet interesting people and learn why the truth is always in the packets. This is going to be a special episode about the Wireshark 4.0 release. I'm here together with Gerald Combs, our main author of the Wireshark application. And we're going to talk a little bit about how this release came to be, what's in it. Not so much, you can refer to the YouTube videos and the release notes for that, but what were some of the thought processes behind some changes, and also what are the challenges actually in releasing something like a major release for a big open source project. So without further ado, welcome Gerald.
Hello Roland, and hello everyone, thank you. Great to be here.
So we came up to 4.0 and I know my intention why we made a major release, but how did we come up with the idea of doing one? I mean, we could just have done another 3. I think it would 10 or 12.
3.8 it would have been.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, when you are developing software and you continuously maintain it and release it, it's healthy and good to have sort of a spring cleaning release where you clean out a whole bunch of old stuff that's been kind of lingering around and maybe add new things that you've been meaning to add for a while that might, I don't know if disruptive is the right word, but it is still, it still consists of a significant change in the project. And probably one of the big things that you'll notice right off the bat when you switch to Wireshark 4 is that the default layout changed. And that's one of the things that went into us thinking, well, if we're going to change this and if we're going to call it 4.0, then let's let's just do this.
I actually, when I was preparing for 4.0 release, I thought back what was the biggest change in 3.0, and I have to be honest, we had some feedback about the display layout issues with 4.0. And I was trying to remember if we had similar things with 3.0, and then I remembered that was the version that we removed all the GTK interface stuff. So 3.0 was the first Qt-only release, and I remember there were quite a few people, not so much angry, but disappointed that we dropped the old interface. But it was for the very much the same reason, to clean up, to allow us to have an easier development process, and especially with GTK, it was quite a nuisance to learn two completely different UI frameworks to develop. So for somebody who hasn't been developing Wireshark or developing a big project, you have to think of it like this. When you implement any functionality in Wireshark and implemented it back in a Wireshark 2.x version, you had to implement the functionality in the backend. So, for instance, a certain kind of dissector code stuff or a certain kind of new statistics version or anything like that. And then you had to develop it in a GTK interface and a Qt interface at the same time. And those two are fundamentally different. It can be a little bit compared to driving a pickup truck and driving a small town car. I'm not saying which is which, but it's a similar situation. So back then it was a huge relief to us to say, okay, let's get rid of GTK. And it put some people off because they were used to the old interface. They liked the old interface. With 4.0, yeah.
Sorry. I just wanted to say that as a project, we do try to keep as much backward compatibility as we can when we do make major changes. And the switch to the Qt interface was an example of that. We kept the old GTK interface around for a long time, probably much longer than we should have. And I know people were disappointed when it went away, but we just couldn't keep maintaining it. It was just this kind of weight around our neck that we had to drag along at the time we finally dropped it. And
I remember one of the biggest issues we had was developing GTK 3 on Windows and Mac because those interfaces just looked immensely ugly.
Yeah. At the time, it just wasn't ready on those platforms. I know the GTK team works very hard at what they do, but they do focus on Linux at the expense of macOS and Windows a lot, and that kind of prompted the change to Qt. And this time around, we dropped support for older versions of I think Red Hat Linux, and one of the big changes was that we dropped support for 32-bit Windows. And the decision behind that was just that I looked around and I realized, okay, I haven't built Wireshark for 32-bit Windows in a couple of years now, and I don't think any of the other Wireshark developers have a 32-bit build environment. And in fact, the only 32-bit build environment the project had was the machine that built our 32-bit packages. And so, if somebody came up with and reported an issue with Wireshark on 32-bit Windows, it just wasn't a thing that we could support very well anymore. And so, I suggested dropping it, and nobody objected. So, that's kind of how we dropped that.
This is, by the way, for our listeners, this is, by the way, our main file process. If somebody wants to change something, remove something, add something, we usually have the usual channels like the Wireshark dev mailing list, or now we have our Discord channel where we put it out and say, I want to do this, does anyone object? And if we don't hear back from anyone over a certain amount of time, then we just take it as agreed on. So just for future reference, if you want to have some feedback in that regard, you have to monitor those sites and those lists, because this is pretty much the only place we have. In the regard of the displayed layout issue, we also filed some issues before that to collect all the ideas we have about Wireshark 4.0. And the display layout issues was I think we opened the issue in February and it was finally removed in June. So it matured for about 4 months.
If you want to know why we changed the default layout, if you've installed Wireshark 4.0, you've no doubt noticed that the default layout has changed. And this is kind of why. We owe the old classic layout to punch cards. And the reason for that is, if you look at this might look familiar. This is a screenshot of the old DOS sniffer made by Network General. And the old sniffer ran...
1 second here. Gerald, 1 second. When we say punch cards, we literally really mean punch cards. Old cardboard cards where you punched hole in it and send it to a mainframe and then let it calculate its thing. We literally mean those.
Yes, because the old DOS sniffer ran on an old DOS computers in text mode back in the 80s, and old DOS computers, their text mode was 80 columns by 25 lines, and they had those screen dimensions because IBM's terminal equipment in the 70s before that, and I think that even the 60s before that, had 80 columns by 25 lines. And they had those dimensions because punch cards had those dimensions, 80 columns, and you were saying, Roland, they actually had 25 lines in them. I wasn't really familiar with that portion of it, but I did know that they had 80 columns.
It's kind of fascinating, by the way, just small history excerpt. It's kind of fascinating how stuff you're used to nowadays is influenced by way back. So if you ever wonder where you get on an airplane on the left side, look up on which side of the body an old horseman has his sword. That's literally the reason. Not saying anything more, you can look it up.
For those who are listening audio only, I've brought up a screenshot of Wireshark in the classic layout mode, and it's on a modern screen. And modern screens have a lot more pixels. They can show a lot more text. Modern screens are also wider. They have a wider aspect ratio than old CRT screens. Old CRTs were a 4:3 aspect ratio. Modern screens have a 16:9 or 16:10 typically. Sometimes they're much wider than that, but when you bring up Wireshark with the classic layout on a modern screen, one of the first things I notice, at least, is that you waste a lot of space in the lower right-hand corner because the byte view, the hex view, isn't that wide. The packet details aren't that wide, and so by changing the layout so that the packet detail and the byte view are next to each other, you have a lot more information vertically, and you're using the screen space a lot more efficiently.
There was a comment from some people that they said, well, I have packet details panes which are quite large with its values. And those are legitimate comments. So
Yes.
there are people who have quite extensive formats inside, but you have to consider our target audience. Yes, there are power users out there who do the daily work with Wireshark all the time and who know how to configure it. But a lot of users, I would say the vast majority of our users, fire up Wireshark once, 2, 3 times a month, if at that, and they have to adapt to the same interface over and over again. I mean, it's our trainers, when they start training like stuff like profiles, stuff like how you can adapt Wireshark to certain capture issues, like you're now capturing TCP, now you're capturing UDP and stuff like that. They're always flummoxed by the fact that quite a few people know that you can have different profiles, you can have different configuration settings for different things you do with Wireshark. The power users do. The vast majority doesn't. And for those people, every time they open up Wireshark, they have this vast amount of empty real estate on their screen, which does pretty much nothing. And they have the byte view underneath, which is about 80% empty when you open it up in a big screen.
And the fact that power users have a lot of profiles, that brings up another issue. If you do prefer one layout versus the other, and you have a whole bunch of different profiles, as someone who uses command line all the time, it was really easy for me to just write up a little, one-liner that forced, either the old or the new layout on all of my profiles. And if you do need to do that, if you're a power user and you have all these different profiles, then we can help you change your layout en masse and get all your layouts changed if that's what you want. Because the standard response of, just go to the preferences and change it. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Should we put that small snippet inside the release notes for the next version, just so that it's a very prominent place for people to find it?
I don't know, because at least on macOS and Linux, the command line, the one-liner that I came up with, if you mess up a single character, you can blow away all of your profiles. So I don't want people to do that.
Yeah, no. Forget that ask.
There's an implied step 0 there of backing up all your profiles first before you try this. But if you are interested in fixing up all your profiles on the command line, just shoot Roland or I an email or a DM on Twitter, and we'll try to get you sorted out. Or hop on Wireshark's Discord. That would probably be the best thing.
Wireshark's Discord general, I think it's even pinned there at the moment, so you will pretty fast find it. But it's the whole issue we had with the display layout change just shows you another fact about developing an open source application. We develop features very close to what we want to achieve. So we have a feature A we want to implement, we implement feature A. Quite a lot of us have quite a lot of experience with the source code, so we know, okay, if we change stuff in this area, we have to test that, and that parts as well. But every now and then we mess up. Let's be honest about it. We mess up. We don't think about the implications. We messed up in this case. And in this case, it was just simply that if you have never changed the display layout setting, then it won't be propagated to any profile you use. And so this is what Gerald was mentioning just now.
That's how our preferences work. Our preferences work such that if you stay with the default preference, then it doesn't get set in the file that we save out. And so whenever you change Wireshark, if the default changes, then that default, you automatically get that new default. And in this case, that's what happened with the display layout.
Yeah, and I get that quite a few people were bumped about it, but sorry.
Yeah, I think the last time we changed the default like that was probably changing from the original PCAP file format to PCAP-NG by default. And that in that case, that was a good argument for carrying users carrying that default setting with the upgrade.
But it goes to show just how conservative we are in those things. We hardly ever drop stuff. We hardly ever change settings. If something went into the program, it stays there. I mean, my favorite example for that is the dissector code for Doom and Doom 2, two MS-DOS games. Besides people who want to run them on vacuum cleaners and IoT devices, apparently, really no one really plays those games anymore. But the server code still, and the dissector for the server code is still inside our application, and it won't go anywhere. The same goes for a lot of other stuff which most people might probably never use, but it's still in there because somebody had the use for it and put it in there. But at the same time, we don't try to actively remove stuff because to be quite honest, it could annoy some people and we don't want it. In the regard of the display layout issue, we knew it was gonna annoy most of the trainers because it was a prime example what trainers did to show people how to customize Wireshark. It was pretty much the first thing quite a lot of them did out of the box. But at the same time, they were also quite pleased by doing it because they just find a different thing they can now demonstrate.
Yeah. I talked to a couple of trainers when we made this change, and they mentioned that, like you said, that's one of the first things they show off. Here's how you get better use of the screen real estate by changing the layout. But the thing is that this does affect, people who teach Wireshark, because a lot of times you're teaching it off of an LCD screen, a projector. And sometimes those don't have a large screen resolution, so you kind of have to switch to the old layout just to make effective use of the display.
One other thing that annoyed me personally when we did 4.0 was I was the one who redesigned the conversation and endpoint dialogues. I think the new ones are better suited for unexperienced users and let them find information quicker. But there were 2-3 things that I forgot to add in from the old ones, and it will now be added in future versions. It's not I forgot to send it in because I didn't want them in there or because I thought they were useless. The main reason why I forgot them is I simply ran out of time to do that. You have to consider we are an open source community. We are doing the majority of changes on the Wireshark source code in our free and spare time. And if that spare time just ceased to exist to various reasons, in my case, 2 little kids who demanded more time, then that's how it is. I apologize if this is annoying, but the thing is, at the same time, we have 3.8 million lines of code, and the majority, vast majority of that is spare time work. And people who basically have coding for Wireshark as their main hobby. We are geeks. We recognize that. We are weirders. We know that. But sometimes stuff gets left out. Sometimes stuff gets changed and works differently because we didn't get around to fine-tuning it. But as it is with an open source project, it will get fine-tuned over time again. It's not like the feature is getting removed and then something just ceases to exist. But what happens is when one developer doesn't have the time anymore, 2 others pick it up and say, okay, I want to add this feature, I want to add this on top of it. And what happens most of the time is they just don't add the old functionality back in, but they add on top of that functionality as well. Well, once I'm here, I can also add that, like, for example. This is actually what happened when Charles Valverde started to change the filter expressions. I think he had an issue, a race condition, something. He was annoyed with how something worked with the filter expressions, and he just wanted to change that part. Took a look at the code, probably figured out that the code was not that nice to work with, started to redesign, and once I'm here, I can also change those, and those things. That's basically how open source development works, right?
Yeah, and that's another example of the reason we decided to go with the version number 4.0, because Joao made so many improvements and changes and fixes to this display filter language. I mean, it's really impressive what he did with that.
Yeah, But at the same time, it's also something that people I have 3 Wireshark books at home, and pretty much in every Wireshark book there's now an issue or a mistake because Wireshark 4.0 does it differently now, and the old version doesn't work anymore.
Sorry about that.
People will be annoyed about that as well. I mean, the most prominent example is that you can say, okay, show me all packets where the port number is either 80443 or 8080, for instance. And what it did back in the old days is open bracket, wrote 80 space 443 space 8080 bracket close, which you can't do anymore. Now you have to separate with commas. And if you have the old version, it doesn't work. And there were already comments on Reddit and Twitter about Wireshark. How did one guy put it? Well, they messed up my profiles. Now I have to throw them all out and do them all again. And it's not that bad, but it's, yeah, you have to take a look. By the way, when it's just display filters, there is a nice editor in the preference dialog which shows you all of them, and they even have syntax checking in there, so you can see pretty fast which ones will still work, which ones won't, so you don't have to go through them step by step to figure it out. One thing I found fascinating doing Wireshark 4.0 precondition was I saw that we never had any list of which library versions did we actually use, which is not entirely true. We do have a list in Wikipedia where we track which operating system we support, which version of operating systems we support, and which version of our base libraries those versions of operating systems have. So for instance, if you have a SUSE Linux enterprise system, it has a certain version, I don't know how to version it, I think it's 10, 11, 12, something like that. So if you have a certain version of SUSE, you know also which version of GTK we have, which version of Qt you can use, and so on. So if you compile Wireshark on those platforms, or if you download it, then you know which packages you need. But for whatever reason, we didn't track what are the minimum package versions. And so one of the things I did, and it took me about 2 days, is track every library we're using and write most of them down into the release notes. And there were some fascinating issues with that. For instance, we say we're using CARES, which is a library we use for name resolution. By the way, this is how I started it. I wanted to have a certain version of that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's what lets us do async DNS resolution. I guess the thing to know here is that most operating systems, when you tell the system you want to look up a DNS name, it'll do that synchronously, meaning you have to wait until the DNS server responds. And CARES lets you do a whole bunch of the user requests in parallel and do it in such a way that you don't have to wait. And so this keeps us from having to freeze the Wireshark user interface. So it is a very important and very handy library that we use.
Yeah, but at the same time, the version we mandated as minimum version, it wasn't the version we compiled with. The version we compiled with was much higher, but the version we mandated as minimum was 5.7 or 6, I think, which is a version that's over 10 years old. And so one of the things we did with 4.0, we went in there and we cleaned up quite a lot of version numbers and set it to higher versions. How did we do that? Well, in most cases, we took a look at what are the versions we're using currently on our build systems and use those versions as minimum requirement versions. In 1 or 2 cases, it either got bumped up higher or lower depending on actively maintained versions, or if there are active security threats out there with a certain version number, if there's active CVEs out there with certain version numbers. And so we bumped it up and down. But again, this is something that led to another issue, which I was strictly not aware of. I had no clue this is happening. Red Hat, in its infinite wisdom, decides to deliver a version but patches in all the changes from one version higher up. And the version higher up was the one we were mandating for CARES. So on the enterprise versions of Red Hat, we couldn't build anymore. With the
so you had a secure version of the library with an insecure version number.
Yes. And I have no clue why. My guess, I don't know. They kind of used some dice to figure out what to do. I have no clue. Those are issues we have to figure out in our spare time. So I was just sitting around one evening and trying to figure out how to solve this issue. And we solved it, by the way, we took the sour byte and the louder version smaller to be the minimum version, which now works again. But the reason why we have those issues is because those Linuxes are actively used. So this is the Red Hat version we now support, I think is 11 or 12, I forgot which one. It will be maintained until 2025, and I think security updates will be available until 2027. And it has been released 2019, so it's quite of a long time support version cycle. And those versions are usually used on, you create a laptop with this Red Hat version, you put it in a data center somewhere, and if somebody comes to the data center and he has to figure something out, he can just take this laptop out of the rack, put it in place where he has to capture and use it. And so this is the reason why they do it. Also, a lot of companies certify certain versions of Linux, and you're only allowed to use that version inside the company. In our case, this was the case why we had to step back, because there was a company using that version. But those are all the things we have to figure out. Now, if we are a paid application, if we are a paid company, what usually happens is we say, well, we don't support your version of Red Hat anymore. We don't support your SUSE version anymore. We don't support this old Debian whatever version. You have to live or die with our release cycle. If you cannot use it, you can use an older version, but you're not allowed to use the newer one. We don't do that. That's not how we want to do things, and this is not how our community works. But at the same time, it leads to a lot of issues we have to deal with, which have nothing to do with code, which have only to do with packet management.
By the way, just some people have pointed out that the most stable API for Linux is Wine, the Win32 compatibility layer that people, that lets you run Windows software. And some games use the Wine. Actually, as I understand it, a lot of games use the Wine interface versus trying to use what's available directly on Linux, because it's a much more stable API, and it's going to run both on systems 10 or 12 years old and on brand new systems. And so I don't think we're going to do that with Wireshark, but it's just to illustrate that this is a tough problem to solve, and people do really weird things to solve this issue of being able to having backward compatibility.
In one of the next versions of Linux kernel, 6.2 or 3, I think, it is planned to remove i486 code, which kind of puts a tear in my eye, because this was the first really usable processor I had. I mean, I had a 286, I had an 86, I had a bunch of other systems, but those were all machines that I pretty much destroyed getting my hands on. The 486 was the one my parents bought for me, and it was the one that I basically learned everything on. So coming 2 years from now, I can no longer compile for that platform, which makes me feel really, really old. But it's now what, 28 years old, so it's long overdue. By the way, I'm currently doing interviews for a new job. The other day I was talking to a young fellow who at this job, he wanted me to explain. I had a day there and I could ask stuff to people working there, how it is to work there and stuff like that. And I was sitting beside a guy who said, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm developing their test system. And I said, oh, okay, what are you using? And it says Windows patch files. I was like, okay. And he goes, you should be well acquainted with those. And I said, why do you mean? You're old. I'm like, excuse me? He made it very kindly and nicely, and we were jesting back and forth, so it was fine. But I said, yeah, you probably did this quite a long time ago. And I said, I'm not that old. How old are you? And he said, well, I was born 1999. And I looked back and said, oh shit, my first Windows batch file I wrote 1993.
Yeah.
I'm old.
Well, And I get that too. When I'll meet somebody and say, and be introduced as the person kind of behind Wireshark, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, I used Wireshark in college, in my networking class." I'm thinking, boy, I wish we had Wireshark when I was in networking, but that's kind of why we have Wireshark, because we didn't have Wireshark when I was in networking, when I was taking my networking class. So
I did have Wireshark when I did my networking class, and if I would stay with that experience of Wireshark, I would never have used it again. It was 1.8. It was 1.8, and for people who remember correctly, 1.8 was, let's put it, capable, not that bug free.
Yeah.
So it pretty much crashed every other trace. But yeah. No, it's things like that, when you talk to people, and my generation and your generation, we kind of proud ourselves of being the first really digital pioneers who kind of, we had to conquer the land and figure out how to go. We forget two things. First of all, there were a bunch of people before us, because you can talk to other core developers who, they have done stuff in the 60s with computers, which I can't do today. So there is that, but at the same time, you have people who grew up with all those stuff nowadays, and you think, oh boy, I'm really old. And coming up to one of our next points, one of the things I remember doing, I have to think back, I think it was 1998, 1999, something like that. I started to write with a new IDE on Linux, which I really enjoyed. It was Kdevelop. And I started to write first applications with this graphical toolkit from KDE called Qt, which I really enjoyed. It was Qt 2 or 3, I can't remember exactly which version it was back then. And I thought to myself, well, that's a toolkit that really makes sense. And I enjoyed the heck out of it, because there were things that in kind of object orientation, in kind of how you do a UI, how you can react to signals and stuff like that, it really made sense. To me, at that point, anyways. What I didn't know back then, and what I wish I would have known sooner, is how much the Qt company just doesn't seem to care about forwards and backwards compatibility once they start developing a new version. And especially not in a sense where, say, okay, I'm going to remove stuff and you can no longer use it. I get that. When you deprecate APIs, when you deprecate classes and objects and stuff like that, I totally get it. We moved to Qt 6 with Windows and Mac OS.
Yeah.
And what we do in a lot of... When you use Wireshark, you have menus, you have context menus, you have right-click options, and you see a lot of the same stuff in all of those. So for instance, the apply as filter, you can have 3, 4, 5 different ways to use that functionality. Behind that, software code-wise, is always the same thing. There is always the same routine. There's always the same object doing it. The thing is, it's just how we're using it depends on where you are. And to achieve that, we create one object. If you don't familiar with code, forget it. Just remember there is one object who does all that. And we kind of refer to that object from different parts of the code. Now, when Qt 6 came around, everything seemed to work fine until we started doing dialogues with that functionality, and suddenly Wireshark crashed. Wireshark crashed like crazy. And the reason why it did was that Qt 6 does the backend configuration of certain entries now, I would say, sharper. They introduced more edge, they introduced more security, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it broke a bunch of code.
Well, I was just going to say, in the packet diagram view, if you're familiar with that, it draws a diagram of the packet much like you would see in a textbook. And that was one of the issues we ran into with the move to Qt 6, was that they changed how a particular API works when you are building strings, and suddenly the packet diagram was showing a whole bunch of extra information that it shouldn't have when it was displaying the values of each field. And so that was something that made it into 4.0, which shouldn't have, and it'll be fixed in 4.0.1, which will be out in a couple of days. By the way, just to interject, we're recording this on a Monday, and I have Wireshark 4.0.1 planned for release in 2 days on Wednesday, which should fix quite a few of the issues that we're discussing here today.
One of the things we're doing with 4.0.1 is that we're stepping back from Qt 6 back to Qt 5 for the Windows builds.
Yeah, and that's mainly due to
and I think
audio.
For the Mac OS as well?
No. Mac OS is fine. The reversion for
just the Windows.
Yeah, the reversion for Windows is because Qt 6 changed the way that they load audio DLLs on Windows, and they did it in such a way that is not compatible with lighter weight versions of Windows, like Windows N and like Server Core. And they're going to fix that in an upcoming release, but in the meantime, we just don't have a usable version of Qt 6 on those platforms, so we just have to switch back to Qt 5.
Now, you might think, who really needs that, and who uses Windows N? Well, Windows N is a version of Windows that's mandated by the European Union. So quite a lot of European companies use that version.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's because basically it's Windows with all the advertisement, and I think also without the games and stuff like that. So it's a do not call home free version, or do call home free version. So a lot of companies who have security issues, like Airbus, for instance, use that version. A lot of telecommunication companies use that version. And telecommunication companies also come into play why the audio issue is an issue, because the RTP player cannot play back audio anymore, which is kind of a given why this dialogue even exists. And a lot of people use it for voice over IP debugging, because you just can easily listen in and how the call is going, what's happening and stuff like that. So this is a big issue with quite a lot of company-wide instances of Wireshark, because it can no longer be used for debugging. Now, you might say, well, they can always go back to 3.6 and not deal with it, which is true, and what was our go-to response in the beginning, until we figured out that we have this automatic update dialog. And users just love that thing because they just click on OK.
Yeah.
And we were so stable in the past that it was a non-issue. When you updated from 3.0 to 3.2 to 3.4 to 3.6, it was a non-issue because it was stable. You got new features, and basically everything stayed the same. Now they did the same thing with 4.0, and they now sitting at a version which they can no longer use for technical reasons, because the audio player is not working. But it's even getting worse, because when you use Qt 6 and you build for macOS, Qt 6 demands a certain version for macOS. I think it's currently they're demanding 10.12. The problem is, if you haven't updated your macOS, 4.0 will no longer run on your macOS version, which is also quite a lot of other users who ran into the same issue. For macOS, I would be honest, I would recommend always updating, but there are certain hardware platforms that are no longer available for higher updates. So they're stuck with a certain version, and now the auto-update dialog tells them to update. They update, and they can no longer run the program. I apologize for that. It was an oversight, and we may be considering implementing some kind of limiter there, and maybe figure out how we can stop certain updates of happening. So this was one of the reasons why people ran into those issues this quickly. We have quite a high adoption rate when a new version comes out. And we have quite a lot of people downloading it in the beginning, especially via the auto-update dialogues. By the way, we do never track how many people use a certain version on a certain platform. There is no tracking code in Wireshark. But we do have download statistics, and we see spikes after a certain release. And we see spikes for specific software packages. And so that's how our assumption works, that a lot of people are adopting quite fast. Yeah. So, Gerald, what is actually, you mentioned that you're going to release on Wednesday 4.0.1. Just for users' consideration, what does a release entail? What do you have to do to release a new version?
On my end, doing an actual actual release consists of sitting down and going through a 3-page checklist of making sure that the CI builds are stable and creating a commit with all the release information that we want to present to users, and just going through and getting everything in place, getting those packages built and published and announced, and whatever else needs to be done for that release. One of the things that we do try to avoid when we do publish packages for Wireshark is we try to avoid complaints, and not complain. Of course, we don't want users to have any reason to complain. We want them to be able to enjoy using Wireshark and get a lot of use out of it. But we also want to make sure that your operating system doesn't complain, because for a long time now, you can't just throw bare code out there and expect, say, Windows or Mac OS to run it without complaint. You have to sign it. And that means having code signing certificates and making sure that those are all in place and applied correctly. And in order to get a code signing certificate, you have to be a legitimate organization, and so you have to go through a process of applying for that and obtaining it. There are all these steps that go into building the releases that just aren't apparent on the surface.
Don't you wish sometimes you go back to just having a small source code everybody downloads, compiles, and be done with it?
Not really. I as much trouble as it is, I like the fact that we publish software that has some sort of assurance that it came from us, and that that is easy to obtain and easy to use and easy to install.
And at the same time, I mean, we are just, I think the latest count was about 20 core developers. We have quite a few hundred developers participating in every release.
Yeah.
But it's a rather small team doing a software which usually has about 100 people working at a company for doing the same piece of software.
Yeah, Wireshark, if it were a commercial project, it would be a huge multi-million-dollar endeavor. And it's when we talk about, unfortunately, shipping software with bugs, that's regrettable. But at the same time, I think it's pretty impressive what we do pull off, because you have to keep in mind that I work on Wireshark full time. I don't know if anybody else does that. And when we do have an issue, it's not like I can, delegate that to one of the other developers, because they just, they don't work for me. I can't assign them tasks. They work for somebody else. And the fact that we do pull this off, I think, is very impressive.
I think we have one or two people who have the majority of the work time relegated to Wireshark, but most of us, me included, we do this in our spare time, in our hobby, or basically because we need a feature fixed for stuff we're doing at work. And every hour we take out of work time, we have to argue with some kind of boss why we're doing it and how it benefits the team we're working at the same time. I want to point two things out in the end, because I think this was quite an enjoyable half hour, 25 minutes something session. Although we are a small bunch of people, we are an enthusiastic bunch of people, and we really love this program. This is why it's our own pride when we release a new version, and you can see people arguing about this feature has to get in, or we are not doing those features anymore, we don't want to do that. We have a large set of rules we kind of regulate ourselves with that ensure that we have a stable version going out. And when something happens like 4.0, it's a chip we take. It's something we don't want to. It's something we are annoyed about ourselves, and we try to do better. But at the same time, as you said, and I really liked how you put it, it's a really small group of people doing a really big program. The other day I was talking to a guy on the bus about some software code, And he was just, and we were talking about, we just met an hour ago before that, and for whatever reason we started about code developing, and he was a software developer, I was a software developer, and he was like, yeah, you know what, it's I'm working, it's such a hard problem. The only tool I can use is Wireshark, and I don't get that application. Took my laptop. Well, let me help you.
Yeah.
But it's you meet random people on places and they know this tool. You have people. One of my first SharkFest, I flew back and the lady sitting in the plane next to me was talking, where do you come from? Where do you go? And I said, well, I was at this developer conference for Wireshark and going back home. What's Wireshark? Well, that's a network. Guy 3 rows in front of me turned around. You're working for Wireshark? I said, yes. Awesome tool. Let me buy your beer.
Wow.
I was completely blown. I was like, don't talk to me. But yeah, that's what we want. We want to release a big program. We want to have fun doing it. And once in a while, some stuff doesn't work as we want to, but we're gonna fix it. So if you want to leave our viewers and listeners, what would be your recommendations if something doesn't work? What can they do? What should they do? What do we want them to do?
If something doesn't quite work, the best place to check, if you think it's unique to you, probably the first place to head is the issue tracker, so that you can write up a bug report. But we have all sorts of resources available if you have issues. We have ask.wireshark.org, which is a question and answer site, and that's probably more suitable to having issues using Wireshark versus reporting a bug. We also have the mailing lists, which we've had in place for decades now, and we have the Discord server. I will say that I do get direct email from people asking for help, and I do appreciate that you want to get help from somebody. But the thing is, as much as I would love to be able to help everybody directly, I just can't do that. I don't have time to do that. So the best places are usually the community resources, like the issue tracker and the mailing lists and Ask and the Discord server.
I mean, there are some other sites as well. For instance, there's a rather active Reddit channel on Facebook. There's a cute community about Wireshark. You can find a community on LinkedIn. But the places Gerald mentioned are those where most of the developers hang out and where you pretty much get in touch with the people who wrote the program. If you can't find the links, we will put some of them in the show notes. And otherwise, if you start up Wireshark, right there on the start page, there is a link to the Discord channel. There's a link to, I think, Ask Wireshark as well, and the mailing list registration. The same you can find on the Wireshark website, which is www.wireshark.org. There is also our extensive, I would add to Gerald's list, there is also our extensive user guide, which is kind of pretty much a small handbook on what are those things called that you see in Wireshark. I would also recommend at a certain point that if for instance you don't have any clue what conversations are, there is also the Wireshark developer guide, which although very specific to certain parts of development, there's also help in there on how to develop certain stuff, and there's a lot of information that can be found there as well.
And there's also SharkFest, which is our in-person conference that we host twice a year, one in the US and one in Europe. That's if you use Wireshark professionally, if your job depends on analyzing packets, I do strongly encourage that you go to SharkFest at least once.
SharkFest Europe starts this week, which should be quite around the time this podcast gets released. But there's also going to be SharkFest US next year, and there's an active YouTube channel. So the same YouTube channel you find the recording of this podcast at, you're going to find recordings of previous SharkFests with a lot of information about packet analysis, Wireshark in general, but also other topics like we had talks about industrial automation, we had talks about the Wi-Fi 6 specification, what is IPv6 and how do addresses work, stuff like that. go check it out. It's a resource of information freely available. You don't have to pay for it. The only thing is, if you came to a Wireshark SharkFest, then usually information and the YouTube recordings are made available to those attending earlier than the general public, but around with a delay of about, I think it's half a year until the next SharkFest. We're gonna release all the videos anyway. Great. So we're coming up on Wednesday again for 401, hopefully.
That's October 26th.
Yeah, the next 4.2 version of Wireshark, which will have more stuff in it than just this one. This is really a hotfix release version we have for fixing the majority of the issues we found with 4.0. There will still stuff be broken, which is then going to be fixed in the next release. Generally speaking, I would say 4.2 will be something around March, April next year, right?
Yeah. Just to be clear, the 4.0.1, 4.0.2 releases and so on, those are maintenance releases, and the first one of those will be out in a couple of days, and then 4.0.2 will be out probably 6 weeks after that. Roland was referring to 4.2.0, which will probably be in the spring sometime.
And just judging from the time space between 3.0 and 4.0, we can assure our listeners that a 5.0 version is not coming soon. My guess is 2025 or something. Yeah. Okay. So, Gerald, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Yeah, we're going to do this again and again and again.
Yeah.
So... and thank you all for listening. Go check out the resources we mentioned. Go check out the links in the show notes, and see you and hear you the next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this installment of the SharkBytes Podcast. If you want to stay informed about upcoming episodes, please subscribe to our podcast on YouTube or your podcasting platform of choice. My name is Roland Knall. See you next time.